September 2025, New Zealand. In just 12 months, nearly 73,000 Kiwis have packed up and left. Not retirees, not tourists, young working-age people. The median age of those leaving? 29. For decades, New Zealand sold itself as a paradise. High living standards, strong institutions, beautiful scenery, and much, much more. It was a country people moved to, not away from. But that story, it's changing. Housing has become unattainable, and the average home now costs more than 14 times the average income. Meanwhile, Kiwis work 15% more than the OECD average, but produce 20% less. So the people with the most options, well, they're doing the most obvious thing. They're leaving. But how did one of the world's most livable countries start bleeding its future? And can they do anything to stop the bleeding? I am Cam for 2 in 20, and this is New Zealand, Paradise Lost. Our story starts in 1984. New Zealand was at a turning point. Inflation was at 18% and growth was flatlining. The country's long-established economic model, well, it was in crisis. A new government led by Prime Minister David Lange and Finance Minister Roger Douglas embarked upon a bold program of neoliberal economic reform to fix it. Their plan, known as Rogernomics, was a radical dose of shock therapy designed to reset the country's trajectory. And here you can think of free trade, deregulation, and small government. And that exodus of young Kiwis today, well, it's not a coincidence. It is the system Rogernomics built, doing exactly what it was designed to do. But first, to understand it, we have to ask the question, what were they trying to fix? More than 100 years before Rogernomics, the country's economic model had been protectionist, highly regulated, and dominated by exports of meat, dairy, and wool to its former colonial master, Britain. So much so that the early economic history of New Zealand can be captured in one glorious statistic: sheep per capita. Yes, sheep per capita. In 1851, there were 2.45 sheep per person in the country, but by 1982, that number skyrocketed to 23 sheep per person. Nearly 70 million sheep on an island of just 3 million. How crazy is that? The example I like to give, it's like the Kiwis were playing Catan with 2 cities on a 6 sheep tile, on sheep ports, and sheep everything. Please subscribe if you understand my joke. Okay, let's get back on track. Now, the number of sheep is one thing, but it's important to understand the dollars associated with these sheep. In 1951, New Zealand had 248 million pounds worth of total exports. Of this, and you're not going to guess this, 128 million pounds was sheep wool. Yes, over 50% of all exports was sheep wool. And if we include frozen meat, most of which was lamb and mutton, and other hides, pelts, and skin, we get 67% of New Zealand's exports. But here's the thing, it wasn't always this rosy. Before 1882, New Zealand had too many sheep, and farmers were finding cost-effective ways to cull their herds. But then in 1882, the ship Dunedin successfully carried frozen mutton and lamb from New Zealand to Britain, transforming New Zealand forever. Between 1875 and 1914, around 80% of New Zealand's exports went to Britain. This trade was huge for the islands. In 1840, when it first became a British colony, average per capita GDP in New Zealand was only 25% of that in the United States, and only 29% of that in Australia. Fast forward to 1900, and per capita GDP in New Zealand was 5% above that in the US and 7% above Australia, giving it one of the highest standards of living in the world. New Zealand became independent from Britain in 1947, but deep economic ties and a dependence on agricultural exports continued. This presented 2 problems. The first was extreme exposure to international commodity prices. When international wool prices collapsed by 40% in 1966 with the invention of synthetic fibers, the industry was decimated. Income per person fell by as much as 5% between 1966 and 1968. The second problem came in 1973 when Britain joined the European Economic Community, a precursor to the European Union. And the way to think about it was that the EEC was basically a trade club. Members traded with each other easily. Non-members, like New Zealand, got hit with extra tariffs. The result? Trade flowed inside Europe and away from everyone else. Overnight, New Zealand was hung out to dry, and in 1974, the economy went into a recession. With this lifeline under threat, New Zealand was in trouble. The economy was not only concentrated, but it was closed off. A fixed exchange rate, tariffs and import licenses to block foreign competition, and heavy subsidies to prop up local industry. To put things into perspective, in 1981, the country imposed an average tariff of 28%. I don't know about you, but that makes Trump tariffs look like parking tickets. Moreover, subsidies to the agricultural sector had ballooned from 3% of farmers' income in the 1960s to around 40% by 1983. Clearly, something had to be done, and good old Roger Douglas believed he had the plan to do it. Enter Rogernomics. Rogernomics was actually kind of similar to Thatcherism in the UK. And you can learn more about the beautiful world of Thatcherism in our world-famous video on the UK here. Douglas's agenda was aggressive, slash tariffs and government subsidies, and liberalize the country's exchange rate in a bid to become a more dynamic and diversified market economy. Prior to 1984, New Zealand had a fortress economy. So in essence, if you wanted to invest in anything, you needed to ask the government for permission. The result of this was that most Kiwis put their money into fixed securities like government bonds. But Rogernomics unleashed the beast. His financial deregulation opened up mom and pop investors to the stock market. And between 1984 and 1987, that market grew by over 300%. What happened, you may ask? Well, people were trading stocks daily and yuppies were buying up Porsches and penthouses on paper gains. But in October 1987, it all came crashing down. From its 1986 peak, the New Zealand stock market lost 71% of its value by 1991. And it didn't recover to these levels until 2016, 30 years later. And it's this crash that we believe it's the single biggest reason Kiwis are so obsessed with one asset class today: property. Since 1987, property prices have increased 10 times, while wages only grew 3.6 times. But before we dive into housing, let's give a bit more color. By 1999, the New Zealand dollar was free floating, average tariffs had fallen to around 5%, and subsidies for agriculture and manufacturing were almost entirely phased out. This succeeded in pushing the economy away from state-supported farming and towards services. Agriculture went from 11% of GDP in 1971 to 6% by 1990, while the manufacturing industry, which itself was focused on making adjacent products like woolen rugs, declined from 25% to 17% of GDP. Since Rogernomics pulled the rug out from the agricultural industry, unemployment grew rapidly. This further trickled down into childhood poverty, which tripled to nearly 30% in 1994. Keep in mind, New Zealand is a first world country, and 30% of children were living in poverty. And I don't want to mistake this for us saying New Zealand should subsidize uncompetitive industries, but rather it is us saying that at a minimum, they should have been way more measured. These citizens were simply playing the game that New Zealand had set up, and leaving them out to dry like that in one fell swoop was catastrophic. All in all, between 1900 and 2000, per capita GDP went from being 105% of US levels to only 57%. We should say the country still enjoys a very high standard of living in many respects. It ranks equal to the US on the Human Development Index and competes with the Nordics on social indicators like quality of democracy. But on the economy, it just has not kept up. New Zealand's youth have grown up in the shadow of Rogernomics, and its outcome is clear. New Zealand is no longer the land of opportunity it used to be, and people, they want out. So, how did New Zealand get so unaffordable? One of the most famous pillars of Rogernomics was the introduction of the Goods and Services Tax, or GST. A 10% flat fee on all consumption, which by the way has now been raised to 15%. I want to take a second to highlight just how insane New Zealand's sales tax is. Firstly, sales tax is a regressive tax, always, meaning it disproportionately impacts low-income people. The way that most countries get around this is by not applying sales tax on necessities like groceries or diapers, for example. But that's a bit of a band-aid solution. But in New Zealand, they don't even want the band-aid. They tax everything. Groceries, diapers, personal health, and craziest of all, newly built homes. Because what says we want more housing than taxing new housing? And at the same time the government introduced the GST, they lowered income taxes, with the top rate declining from 66% to 33% by 1989. Are you following so far? GST made new homes more expensive and therefore less attractive, reducing construction of new homes. Concurrently, lower income taxes for top earners created tons of disposable income, and because they feared the stock market, they plowed it all into housing, driving up home values like crazy. But the geniuses in New Zealand were not done yet. Firstly, they never introduced a capital gains tax on housing, meaning that while work and consumption were taxed, growing your home equity wasn't. Then 1990 comes around and they abolished the federal land tax, meaning the only tax on housing was a council tax, which is just generally super low. To put this into perspective, a $1 million home in Auckland has about $3,000 in council taxes, whereas the same house in Austin, Texas would pay $20,000 in property taxes. That is a 6 times difference. To simplify it, unproductive property became the most attractive, most tax efficient, and least risky asset class in all of New Zealand. Oh, you thought I was done? Nope, there's more. Unfortunately, in 1991, the government introduced the Resource Management Act, which sought to protect the country's national environment. The RMA brought in complex zoning restrictions which limit where residential properties can be built. This has dramatically pushed up land prices, which has made new homes even more expensive. And according to a cabinet paper from the Ministry of Housing, each square meter of land inside Auckland's rural-urban boundary is between 4.2 to 4.4 times more expensive than land immediately outside it. What's the reason for this? Well, you can't build outside the boundary. All this red tape has made it much harder to build new homes, and housing supply has just not kept up with demand. In 2022, New Zealand had one of the worst housing to population ratios in the OECD, with 396 dwellings per 1,000 people. That's 7% fewer than Canada and 10% fewer than in the UK, both which have horrible track records on housing affordability. But the problems aren't just on the supply side. Demand has increased significantly. Do you remember the banking reforms undertaken during Rogernomics? That deregulation dramatically increased the availability of loans to the property sector. And what happened? Well, lending volumes exploded as a result. In 1980, housing loans represented only 13.6% of total bank lending. By 2020, that had ballooned to reach around 61% of total bank lending. Naturally, the expansion of lending puts massive upward pressure on housing prices. But it wasn't just that there was more cash chasing a highly limited supply of homes. There were also more people just looking for houses in the first place, and that's primarily due to significant immigration into the country. While Kiwi citizens are net emigrants, the country saw a surge in immigration from non-citizens following the pandemic, which only put further pressure on housing costs. At its peak, net migration hit nearly 136,000 in the 12 months to October 2023, even as large numbers of Kiwis were leaving. That alone grew the population by 2.7% in a single year. And that surge in house prices, it's great for homeowners who've ridden that market upwards. But for young people on low incomes, it's a disaster. Auckland, the country's largest city, was rated the 7th least affordable city in the world in 2023. The city now has a median property price more than 17 times the median annual income. The situation is so bad that in 2021, the New Zealand Human Rights Commission described it as a human rights crisis. Yeah, you heard that right, a human rights crisis. And it's not just housing. Overall costs of living have soared since the end of the pandemic. New Zealand did relatively well during COVID, benefiting from its isolation island. But extensive stimulus from quantitative easing and low rates helped to trigger a surge in inflation, which peaked at 7.3% in 2022. As a result, the central bank was forced to sharply increase rates to tame this inflation. It hiked rates by 3.5% between December 2021 and November 2022. This was the second largest correction by any central bank in any major internationally traded currency, second only to the US. The inevitable result? Well, you guessed it, New Zealand went into recession in 2023, even despite the surge in inward migration that should have boosted economic activity. Now, if incomes were rising at the same rate, this wouldn't be a problem. But like we just described, they aren't. If you were to ask any Kiwi why they left, they're gonna give you one big reason: I want to earn more money. And who doesn't? The problem is that New Zealand faces super weak labor productivity. The average Kiwi made $55 in purchasing power parity terms per hour in 2024. Let's use some peers to compare. Australia, $81 per hour, where most Kiwis move to, and in the US, $116 per hour. In fact, it's on par with countries in Eastern Europe like Poland and Latvia that enjoy significantly lower standards of living. What this means is that workers in the country produce less for every hour worked and earn less. But the numbers get worse. Average wages in New Zealand in 2024 were 4% lower than their levels in 2019, significantly worse than the OECD average and peers like Australia and Canada. In fact, labor productivity actually plunged 9.4% in 2023, the last year it was measured. But this begs the question, why is labor productivity in New Zealand so bad? And the problem, well, it's simple. New Zealand's economy is still built around making things that don't make very much money. The country's agricultural sector has shrunk since the wool exporting glory days before Rogernomics, but other high value added sectors have not caught up to replace it. Remember all those fluffy sheep? Even today, there are still 4.5 sheep per person in New Zealand. Now I want you to think about the world's most productive countries. Singapore or the US have super high labor productivity because they are highly innovative economies that rely on high value added products and services like technology and financial services. Think of companies like Tesla, Nvidia, or JP Morgan. These are giants in knowledge intensive industries that drive the world economy forward. New Zealand's top export in 2024? Milk, butter, and cheese, which accounted for 28% of overall exports that year. Second up was meat, accounting for 12%, and third was timber, accounting for 7%. If we take it all together, fruits, logs, meat, and milk account for 54% of the country's exports. Even in what remains of the country's manufacturing sector, the food sector is dominant, representing around 32% of value-added manufacturing in the country. And while agriculture's role in the economy has fallen since the 1980s, it wasn't replaced by productive high value-add industry or services. And believe it or not, it was mostly the country's property market. In 2024, construction and real estate services combined made up 22.5% of the country's economy. Property has played such a big role that in the last 40 years, the country's entire economy has been described as a housing market, with bits tackled on. Our main point is that New Zealand's economy remains overly reliant on these low value add sectors like agriculture and construction. And the degree of this dependence is remarkable. If you track economic complexity, which measures how many different things an economy can make and how hard those things are to make, and track it against GDP per capita, you generally find that more developed economies are more complex. But good old New Zealand stands out for its terrible performance. To put things truly into perspective, New Zealand has an even less complex economy than Saudi Arabia or Kuwait, both of which are known to be almost entirely dependent on oil exports. You can also see this in other data points too. In 2023, New Zealand spent $836 per person on R&D. What was the OECD average? $1,586. This means fewer startups, less technology, less innovation, and ultimately, lower wages. The difficult reality for New Zealand is that it is a small and isolated market that has close relations with a significantly larger and less isolated market in the form of Australia. Let me give you an example. In the 2025 Global Financial Centers Index, Sydney ranked 41 places ahead of Wellington, New Zealand's capital. The most innovative segments of the economy, naturally, they prefer to set up shop in concentrated areas, and that naturally takes them to large Australian cities like Sydney and Melbourne, whose combined population is double that of the entirety of New Zealand. New Zealand is a country blessed with fertile land and an ideal climate that allows it to grow food that they export to big partners like the US and China. But its geographic isolation and small population mean that it's not a dynamic or innovative one. That is something that is going to be very, very hard to change. First glance, New Zealand is struggling with many of the same problems facing other highly developed Western economies. Canada, UK. Completely unaffordable cities, pathetic productivity growth, and serious missteps in economic policy. The government is trying to fix things. They've sought to significantly increase new house building, restrict low-skilled immigration, and drum up high-tech investment. But New Zealand can't have its mutton and eat it too. If the country wants to become more affordable, there are only two sustainable ways. The first is to add more housing and in doing so lower the value of homes. But this, you see, it's impossible because homeowners would revolt and politicians would lose their seats. Moreover, the economy is basically all housing at this point, and any correction would have serious economic consequences. The second option is to increase income so that it catches up with housing. But New Zealand's economic challenges are in some ways more profound than that of countries like Canada or the UK. The UK is a financial hub for the world and has dense networks of institutions, public and private, that have enabled business proliferation. Canada has abundant high-value natural resources, think oil, gas, and minerals, that it leans on to support its otherwise weak economy. Unfortunately, New Zealand is a sparsely populated nation in the middle of nowhere that has neither of these. So for now, the conclusion is simple. Young Kiwis, stop counting sheep and do the only thing that makes sense. Leave. Subscribe to 2 in 20 for more on economics, politics, and sheep. Thank you for watching.